Every one of these songs was the other side of the record. The one Motown wasn't betting on. The one a producer picked almost as an afterthought, just to fill space on the flip. And then a DJ played the wrong side. Or the right listeners found it anyway. 12 songs that Motown didn't plan to be hits, that ended up outselling, outlasting, or completely burying the single sitting right next to them on the same 7 inches of vinyl. This is the real story of Motown's most famous accidents.
With no one but you.
Number 12. The Miracles, Shop Around.
There's still some things that you don't understand.
This is the one that actually matters to Motown's survival. In January of 1959, a 29-year-old Gordy had borrowed $800 from his family's cooperative savings fund to start a record label, a fund where every relative had to pitch their case at a family meeting and get a unanimous yes. His own family reportedly told him he was 29 years old and already a failure. He needed a hit, fast, or the whole thing was over before it began.
Mama told me, you better shop around.
In September of 1960, the Miracles cut a single with Who's Lovin' You as the planned lead side, a showcase ballad for Smokey Robinson's vocal runs. The flip side was Shop Around, a loose, playful song built on advice Smokey's own mother had given him about not settling down too fast.
My mama told me, you better shop.
Record buyers and radio programmers made their own decision. Shop Around became Motown's first million-selling single, hitting number 1 on the R&B chart and climbing to number 2 on the Hot 100, the song that proved Gordy's whole experiment could actually work.
Better shop around.
The Miracles later re-recorded a punchier, more polished version of the song at 3 in the morning after Gordy heard a jazzier arrangement on the radio and rushed the group back into the studio overnight to compete with it. That's the version that became the hit. Who's Lovin' You never charted nationally at all. The song Motown planned to sell the world on lost to the one it almost buried on the back. The loan itself carried real teeth. Gordy had agreed to a 6% interest rate, due within a year, with future royalties on the line if he failed to repay it. Smokey Robinson, only 17 when he first met Gordy, had been the one urging him toward starting his own label in the first place. After Gordy grew frustrated watching outside publishers shortchange him on his songwriting royalties. Shop Around wasn't just Motown's first big hit. It was the single piece of evidence that justified every dollar the Gordy family had reluctantly agreed to risk. Number 11. Little Stevie Wonder, Fingertips PT2. By most accounts, this is the biggest B-side in Motown's entire history. In May of 1963, Motown released a live recording of 12-year-old Stevie Wonder's Frenzied Harmonica Showcase, split across 2 sides of a single, Fingertips PT1 as the lead, and Fingertips PT1 as 2, mostly instrumental, as the flip. The label initially treated Part 2 as an afterthought. It wasn't one. As Gordy realized the second half's greater appeal, the one with the band trying to wrap up the song before a fired-up Stevie launches back in, and bassist Larry Moses audibly panicking, asking, "What key?" What key? Motown reissued the single just 16 days later with the sides flipped. Radio stations across the country, from Akron to Seattle, picked Part 2 as their favorite track of the summer. By August 10, 1963, Fingertips PT2 was sitting at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, Motown's first ever number 1 pop hit, and it belonged to a boy who wouldn't turn 13 for another 3 months. It also made him the youngest artist ever to top the Hot 100, a record that still stands. The recording itself came from a live album capturing Stevie mid-performance on Motown's traveling Motown Review Package tour, the raw energy of the room baked directly into the vinyl, hardly the polished, carefully produced sound Motown was known for on its studio singles. He was billed on the label copy as Little Stevie Wonder, the 12-year-old genius, a title that, on the strength of one chaotic, half-improvised B-side, turned out to be far less of an exaggeration than anyone at Motown could have guessed at the time. The confused, half-improvised chaos on the back half of a live recording, the part nobody planned to be the hit, turned out to be exactly the moment that made America pay attention to Stevie Wonder for the very first time. Number 10. The Marvelettes, Forever.
If you want to.
By 1963, the Marvelettes had already made Motown history as the group behind Please Mr. Postman, the label's first ever #1 pop hit. Their follow-up single, Locking Up My Heart, carried real significance of its own. It was the very first hit, written by the newly formed songwriting team of Holland, Dozier, and Holland, the trio who would go on to write dozens of Motown's biggest records. It peaked at a respectable but modest number 44.
Just to be with you.
Tucked on the back was Forever, written by Brian Holland alongside Freddie Gorman and Lamont Dozier, with Wanda Young delivering the lead vocal. It climbed to number 78 on the Hot 100, a smaller chart placement than its A-side, but a far longer cultural life.
But I'll always be just a fool.
Forever went on to be recorded by Marvin Gaye, by Martha and the Vandellas, by Stevie Wonder, and by a long list of other artists across the decade, from Carla Thomas to the Orlons to Baby Washington and Don Gardner, whose version was still charting a full decade later, in 1973. The song Motown was actually promoting made history for the songwriting team behind it. The one they tucked on the flip side turned out to be the one other artists couldn't stop returning to for the next 10 years.
Just to be with you thrills.
Wanda Young's lead vocal on Forever arrived at an important turning point for the group. She was gradually taking over lead duties from founding member Gladys Horton, a transition that would define the Marvelettes' sound for the rest of the decade, even as the group's chart fortunes never quite recovered the heights of Please Mr. Postman. The flip side, in other words, ended up outliving both the single it rode in on and, eventually, much of the group's own commercial momentum.
Me through and through, and darling, forever.
It's a quietly common pattern across Motown's catalog. A group's biggest chart triumph often arrives early, while its most enduring, most covered song shows up almost by accident a year or two later, tucked onto the back of something else entirely.
Darling, forever.
Number 9. Marvin Gaye, I'm Crazy 'Bout My Baby.
Take some hugging and a kissing.
In late 1963, Marvin Gaye had his first real smash with Can I Get a Witness, the song that introduced America to the songwriting team of Holland, Dozier, and Holland at Full Power.
Now, you can talk about the real thing.
It climbed to number 22 on the Hot 100 by the end of December, a genuine hit and a sign of the sound Motown would ride for the rest of the decade.
My baby, I'm mad about my.
Its flip side, I'm Crazy 'Bout My Baby, reached only number 77 domestically. But across the Atlantic, both sides of that single found an audience nobody at Motown had planned for.
She's sweet enough for me.
British group Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers recorded their own version of the B-side, while a scrappy young band called the Rolling Stones sought out Can I Get a Witness specifically to cover on their very first album.
Suit me to a T.
It was an early, telling sign of what was coming. The British invasion bands that would soon dominate American radio were quietly building their own sound directly out of Motown's back catalog, flip sides included.
She's sweet enough for me. I'm crazy.
Gaye and Motown songwriters started collecting international royalty checks from a British rock scene that hadn't even fully broken through yet, proof that a lesser B-side could still open doors an ocean away from where it was recorded.
Don't you know we're doing all right?
Gaye himself had only recently transitioned from session drummer and Motown's brother-in-law by marriage to Anna Gordy into a genuine recording star in his own right, and Can I Get a Witness marked one of his first real steps toward the sound that would define his 1960s output.
All about my baby.
The fact that its flip side ended up more valuable overseas than at home was an early hint of just how far Motown's reach was about to extend beyond Detroit.
I've got enough loving to last.
If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 8. The Temptations, Don't Look Back. In late 1965, The Temptations released My Baby as their latest single, a song that climbed to a solid number 13 on the Hot 100 by the end of November. Tucked on the flip side was Don't Look Back, written by Smokey Robinson and fellow Miracle Ronnie White, featuring a haunting lead vocal from Paul Williams rather than the group's more famous frontmen. My Baby did its job and faded into the Temptations' deep catalog. Don't Look Back did something stranger. It kept getting rediscovered, decade after decade, by artists who had nothing else in common. Bobby Womack covered it. Al Green covered it. Reggae legend Peter Tosh recorded a version with Mick Jagger singing alongside him. Senegalese star Youssou N'Dour cut a version. So did Southside Johnny, Elvis Costello, and, improbably, the British pop group the Sugar Babes decades later. More than 20 separate artists across multiple genres and generations have returned to a song that peaked at a modest number 83 on its original release, tucked behind a single most casual fans have long since forgotten. Paul Williams, the Temptation who sang lead on the track, would go on to struggle with declining health in the years that followed, gradually losing his central role in the group by the end of the decade, which makes Don't Look Back one of the clearer showcases for a voice that later generations of fans mostly encounter secondhand, through the cover versions rather than the Temptations' own original. It's a strange kind of legacy. A song largely forgotten by casual American radio listeners has nonetheless been passed hand to hand by musicians across reggae, punk, soul, and pop for half a century, each new version quietly keeping Williams' original vocal performance alive by association, even for audiences who've never once heard the Temptations' actual recording. Number 7. The Elgins' Darling Baby.
Since you left these arms of mine.
The Elgins burned brightly at Motown, but briefly. Their entire run of real chart success lasted barely a year.
Only without you.
In early 1966, the label released Put Yourself in My Place, another Holland Dozier Holland composition, as their lead single. It stalled at a disappointing number 92 on the Hot 100.
One more time.
Its flip side, Darling Baby, also written by the same songwriting team, told a different story entirely. It climbed to number 72 on the pop chart while becoming a genuine top 10 R&B hit, giving the group back-to-back R&B successes alongside their other 1966 single, Heaven Must Have Sent You.
I wondered who's holding it.
For a group that never quite broke through the way Motown's biggest acts did, Darling Baby represented their clearest commercial validation, the proof that the songwriting and the vocal performances were there, even if the promotional machine never fully got behind them the way it did for the Supremes or the Temptations. The song had an unexpected second life 6 years later, in 1972, when singer Jackie Moore, best known for her own hit, Precious, Precious, recorded her own version and gave Darling Baby a fresh run on the R&B charts, proof that a well-written flip side from a briefly successful group could still find new ears long after the original act had faded from the spotlight. The Elgins themselves were never given the sustained promotional push Motown reserved for its top-tier acts, and the group's run of hits stayed largely confined to 1966 before their momentum faded, making Darling Baby and Heaven Must Have Sent You essentially the entirety of their commercial legacy. Both of them songs Motown had initially positioned as the lesser half of their respective singles.
Can't help but feel it should be.
It's a pattern worth sitting with. A group that never received the marketing budget of the Supremes or the Temptations still managed 2 genuine hits in the same calendar year, purely on the strength of Holland Dozier Holland's songwriting and the group's own vocal chemistry, regardless of which side of the record Motown decided to lead with. Number 6, J.R. Walker and the All-Stars, Shoot Your Shot. In June of 1966, Junior Walker and the All-Stars released I'm a Roadrunner, which became a genuine top 20 pop hit and one of the defining singles of the group's raw, saxophone-driven sound.
Don't stand on the block, come inside.
Tucked on the flip side was Shoot Your Shot, written by Walker himself alongside his band's drummer, James Graves, and engineer Lawrence Horn. The flip side didn't chart at all on its initial release. It simply rode along in Roadrunner's shadow for an entire year. Then in the summer of 1967, Motown made an unusual decision. Rather than let Shoot Your Shot disappear into the vault, the label reissued it as its own topside single. Radio responded. It climbed all the way to number 44 on the Hot 100, a full 12 months after the song had first quietly appeared on the back of somebody else's hit. It's one of the rarer stories in this list. Not a DJ flip in real time, but Motown itself recognizing a year later that it had buried something with real commercial life left in it. Sometimes the label got the sequencing wrong the first time and simply corrected course once the evidence was undeniable, giving an overlooked flip side an entirely separate chart run of its own. Junior Walker's raw saxophone-forward sound had always sat slightly apart from Motown's more polished pop productions, released on the label's grittier soul subsidiary rather than the main Tamla or Motown imprints, which may be exactly why a song like Shoot Your Shot could survive being overlooked for a full year and still find an audience once radio finally caught up to it. Walker's own instrumental voice, the honking, propulsive saxophone that defined nearly everything the All-Stars recorded, gave even a buried B-side an identity distinct enough to stand on its own once programmers actually gave it a chance. Proof that in Walker's case, the songwriting mattered less than simply getting the record in front of the right ears. Number 5, The Four Tops, I'll Turn to Stone. By 1967, the Four Tops were one of Motown's most reliably powerful vocal groups, and 7 Rooms of Gloom, as dark and dramatic a lyric as Holland Dozier Holland ever wrote, became another solid hit for them, reaching number 14 on the Hot 100 in June. Its flip side, I'll Turn to Stone, was gentler and more melodic, and it marked something quietly significant for Motown's songwriting machine. It was one of the first Holland Dozier Holland compositions where a young writer named R. Dean Taylor also received a writing credit, working alongside Brian Holland and Lamont Dozier on the lyrics, while the more established duo built out the melody. Taylor would go on to become a successful Motown artist and writer in his own right, eventually scoring his own hit with Indiana Wants Me a few years later. I'll Turn to Stone reached number 76 on the Hot 100, a modest showing next to its A-side, but a meaningful stepping stone for a writer who was still working his way up through Motown's ranks. Sometimes, a B-side's real significance isn't its chart position at all, but who got their name on the credits for the very first time, and where that name went next. Levi Stubbs' powerhouse lead vocal, the same voice that made 7 Rooms of Gloom so dramatic, carried the flip side too, proof that the Four Tops rarely delivered a lesser performance just because a song had been designated the B-side. The group's reputation for consistency meant even their cast-offs sounded like something another act would have promoted as a single. By 1967, the Four Tops had already spent several years as one of Motown's most dependable hit machines, built on Holland Dozier Holland's dramatic, string-laden productions and Stubbs' unmistakable, near-shouting delivery, and even a comparatively minor entry in their catalog carried that same unmistakable stamp of quality that made the label's assembly line approach to hit-making so effective in the first place. Number 4. Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Forget Me Not. This is the one entry on this list that lands closest to a genuine moment of turmoil at Motown. Not a company-wide financial crisis, but 1968 was the year the label's most important songwriting team, Holland, Dozier and Holland, walked out entirely and sued Motown over royalties, throwing the company's hit-making machine into real disarray. Against that backdrop, Motown released I Promise to Wait My Love as Martha Reeves and the Vandellas' latest single. It stalled at number 62, part of a chart slide the group never fully recovered from, as Motown's attention shifted increasingly toward Diana Ross and the Supremes.
These little things I'll share with no one but
Its flip side, Forget Me Not, carried a weight none of the singles around it did. Motown songwriter Sylvia Moy, usually remembered for her work reviving Stevie Wonder's career, wrote it after her own brother, Melvin, was sent to serve in Vietnam, folding real wartime anxiety into what sounds, on the surface, like a simple love song. It reached number 93 on the Hot 100, a quiet showing at home. In Britain, though, the song found the audience it deserved. When reissued as its own single in 1971, it became a number 11 hit, and it remains a staple of British oldies radio to this day, decades after most casual American listeners forgot it ever existed. The timing mattered. With Holland, Dozier and Holland gone, and suing the company they'd helped build, Motown's songwriting bench in 1968 was thinner than it had been in years, making a genuinely personal, well-crafted song like Forget Me Not more valuable to the label's catalog than its modest domestic chart position ever suggested, even if nobody at Motown fully recognized that value until British listeners did it for them, 3 years later. Number 3. Diana Ross and the Supremes, The Young Folks. By 1969, Motown's flagship act was still commercially significant, but the songs were increasingly a family affair rather than the product of the label's classic hit-making teams. No Matter What Sign You Are was written and produced by Berry Gordy himself alongside Hank Cosby, and it peaked at a modest number 31 on the Hot 100 in June. Its flip side, The Young Folks, was the work of Berry's brother George Gordy, and it became Diana Ross and the Supremes' very first flip-side hit on the chart, reaching number 69. It wasn't a major hit by the Supremes' own extraordinary standards, but it had an unusually long afterlife for a modest chart entry. The very next year, Motown's newest and biggest sensation, the Jackson 5, recorded their own version of The Young Folks and tucked it as the B-side to ABC, the song that shot straight to number 1 and became one of the defining hits of 1970. A song that started as a minor flipside for Motown's biggest act of the 60s ended up quietly riding along behind Motown's biggest new act of the 70s, a small thread connecting two very different eras of the same company. The single arrived at a transitional moment for the Supremes themselves. Diana Ross would announce her departure from the group for a solo career within the year, meaning The Young Folks belongs to one of the final chapters of the classic Supremes lineup, a quiet, family-written flipside capping off an era that had been built almost entirely on outside songwriters and producers, rather than the Gordy family's own material. It's worth noting how much had changed by 1969. The Holland-Dozier-Holland team that built the Supremes' 10 #1 hits was already gone, and Motown was increasingly leaning on in-house family talent to fill the gap, a shift that would only accelerate once the label relocated its operations to Los Angeles a few years later. Number 2. Eddie Kendricks. It's So Hard for Me to Say Goodbye.
Yours.
After leaving the Temptations to launch a solo career, Eddie Kendricks released This Used to Be the Home of Johnny May as his first real solo single in 1971, a dramatic, ambitious track that producer Frank Wilson had to work hard to convince the notoriously shy Kendricks to even sing in his full range on. Radio largely passed on it. Programmers instead turned to the flip side. It's So Hard for Me to Say Goodbye, also produced by Wilson. Sales were modest, and the single only crept to number 88 on the Hot 100, barely a hit by any conventional measure. But it did something more important for Kendricks at that exact moment in his career. It got him onto the chart at all, as a solo artist, for the very first time, after years spent as one voice among five in one of Motown's biggest groups.
I can't ignore the side I read.
That modest toehold mattered. 2 years later, in 1973, Eddie Kendricks released Keep On Truckin', which shot to number 1 on the Hot 100 and made him one of Motown's biggest solo stars of the decade.
'Cause when I hold you, I'll call you.
The unglamorous, barely charting B-side that got him started was the first proof that a former Temptation could actually build a solo identity of his own, proof that arrived, fittingly, on the side of the record nobody was paying attention to. Kendricks had spent nearly a decade as one of the Temptations' signature voices, his high, clear falsetto driving hits like The Way You Do the Things You Do and Get Ready. But stepping out from a five-man harmony group into a solo spotlight was a far riskier proposition than the label's promotional plans for Johnny May initially suggested. It took the quiet, overlooked flip side to prove the risk was worth taking at all. Number 1. Mary Wells. Two Wrongs Don't Make a Right. By 1963, Mary Wells was Motown's first true star, the label's biggest name before the Supremes had scored a single hit of their own. Laughing Boy, another Smokey Robinson composition, kept that streak alive, climbing to number 15 on the Hot 100 in March. Its flip side, Two Wrongs Don't Make a Right, was also written by Smokey Robinson and Berry Gordy together, a song about a woman warning her lover not to repeat his mistakes after she'd been caught cheating herself, pleading with him not to turn her away.
I can't say that you're wrong.
Because Wells had just come off 3 consecutive top 10 hits, Radio and fans were primed to pay attention to anything new from her, flip side included. It climbed to number 100 on the Hot 100, a small chart placement, but real proof of just how much commercial trust Wells had built with audiences by that point in her career.
I broke your heart.
That trust wouldn't last much longer at Motown. Wells had signed her original contract at just 17 years old, without independent legal representation, and within a year of two wrongs don't make a right, she would turn 21, argue that her original deal was never fully valid, and walk away from the label entirely at the absolute height of her success, with My Guy, a decision that would define the rest of her career in ways nobody could have predicted from a modest B-side that barely cracked the Hot 100.
I can't say that you're wrong.
It's a fitting closer for this list, because Mary Wells's story captures exactly what these 12 songs have in common. Motown's factory line hit-making system was so consistently strong in its songwriting and performances that even the material treated as an afterthought, the song Stuck on the Back, meant to fill space, was frequently good enough to become a hit almost by accident.
I took your love.
That was the real secret weapon behind Motown's golden years. There was rarely such a thing as a truly throwaway side.